This week on the Wheelhouse. Energy bills and funding for students with disabilities. Is help on the way? For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse, the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. Connecticut residents have the highest electricity bills in the country. That's according to LendingTree's analysis of U.S. Census Bureau data. The state also has the second highest percentage of residents who can't pay their electricity bills. Leaders from both political parties have promised relief from these steep electric rates, but we're still in the dark about how they'll keep the lights on. This hour, we'll discuss why energy rates are so high, how we might bring them down, and how the climate could be impacted. Sounds like we're going to do a lot of easy work this hour. We'll see. Later in the show, how might proposed changes to school funding impact students with disabilities? We'll talk about that later. Now, John Moritz, reporter covering energy and environmental policy for the Connecticut Mirror. John, great to have you on the show. Congratulations on the new job at the Mirror.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So glad to have you back on the show. Also with us, Eric Kotovich, the assistant professor of environmental resource economics at the University of Connecticut. Eric, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming into studios today. Folks, we want to ask you, are your electric bills getting more expensive? If you don't mind, please share, just give us some kind of perspective. Like it went up this amount over this time. That would be helpful, just so we could kind of dissect this situation and work together here. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. John, during the State of the State address, what did Governor Ned Lamont have to say about energy costs, affordability, and do you think that this is a top priority this legislative session?
Well, he said that he hears the concerns of Connecticut residents when they're talking about their energy bills, and he says he sympathizes with them. As for what to do about it, I think a lot of that remains to be seen, is going to be worked out in the legislative session. Two things in particular that he mentioned in his State of the State address had to do with natural gas and nuclear, and not putting those out of sight when we look at our resource mix in the future. I think a lot of people, though, realize and understand that either expanding pipelines or building some type of new nuclear facility are years-long projects, and these are not solutions that are going to help in the near term. And Lamont did address that in his speech, that these are longer-term potential fixes. But in the near term, that's, from what we've seen from lawmakers, that's still kind of up in the air and up for debate.
Empathized with the people, but it didn't seem like he was sympathetic to the work that lawmakers are doing, or at least it sounded like he kind of challenged them in the speech. Did you feel that way as well?
Well, I think...
Or at least to come up with a creative solution?
I think both Lamont and lawmakers are in a difficult spot. You mentioned that Connecticut having among the highest electricity rates in the country, but when you look at our neighbors, particularly the other New England states that share a regional electric grid with us, they're all in the top 10, as is New York. So one of the common refrains that you hear from policymakers when talking about this is that we're at the end of the natural gas pipeline, which New England gets the vast majority of its electricity needs from natural gas generating electric plants. And there's just a limited supply and capacity that can be delivered to us because of the pipeline constraints.
Supply to some people is simply seen as just a logistic. Obviously, more people are concerned about the environment and what natural gas does to the environment. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, environmentalists certainly weren't happy to hear Lamont mention natural gas and nuclear in his speech. Those are two resources, natural gas in particular, that they see as, contributing to the problems that we have with global emissions and climate change. Nuclear is very expensive. It hasn't been done in recent decades in very many states. There's only been handful of projects that have come online in recent years, and those have been very expensive. And obviously, there's the potential for catastrophe there. Advocates for nuclear argue that standards have been increased in recent years, and we have not seen any major meltdowns in decades in this country, and that it's a safe, clean, and alternative form of energy.
Eric Kotovich, assistant professor of environmental and resource economics at the University of If we were to go all in, say, on this energy resources, could prices go down?
So that's a great question. And something important to remember about the gas prices is that they're very volatile. So when you're super dependent on gas prices, they might be cheap for a while, but they are affected by world events, by extreme weather events, by things happening in other places. And those prices can go up and down, and therefore that can introduce a lot of volatility into people's electricity bills. Something like nuclear and even renewables like solar and wind are much sort of more stable and reliable sources of electricity. Gas has been trending downwards since the fracking revolution began, around like 2007 or so. Overall, gas prices have been coming down. They spiked during COVID and with the war in Ukraine, but have since come down again. So gas has become quite cheap in the U.S. because of fracking. But like John suggested, getting it here, you run into some constraints related to the pipeline grid network. And so fixing that might require some big long-term investments in pipeline infrastructure that could give Connecticut better access to cheap gas coming out of fracking in Pennsylvania, but could lock us in to fossil fuel infrastructure that lasts for decades and runs up against Connecticut's long-term goals to reach net zero.
So it runs up against net zero initiatives. There's the volatility aspect. Is there anything else that you could think about in long-term impacts associated with doubling down on natural gas?
So gas is a lot cheaper than coal. So, Connecticut has made a transition away from coal power, and that is a huge gain for air quality. It's a huge gain for carbon emissions. But gas is still a fossil fuel. Methane is a really potent greenhouse gas, and it still has those volatility elements to it. And so I think gas is an important part towards the transition towards a more renewable-based energy system because you can turn on a gas peaker plant quickly to fill in gaps. The sun's not always shining, the wind's not always blowing. Nuclear is not fulfilling the full energy needs of the state. And even if you wanted to reinvest more in nuclear, that's a very, very long-term solution like John suggested. So gas plays an important role in filling those gaps.
We know our listeners care about sustainable energy and the environment. More than 700 of you flagged it as one of your top 5 concerns in 2024's election survey. We had more than 700 responses. Chime in now if you'd like to talk to us. Call us with any questions you have about your electric bill, 888-720-9677. And I understand we have a caller right now, Catherine from Norfolk. Good morning, Catherine.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for calling the Wheelhouse this morning.
My pleasure. We have recently received a bill that our usage fee was usage fee was half. Essentially, the delivery charge was twice our usage fee. $110 for what we had used and over $250 for the delivery charge. And it was quite surprising simply because we have solar panels and we're only really paying out of pocket for energy bills about 5 months of the year. We're very lucky that the panels do as well as they do, but at this time of year, obviously, shorter days mean less energy production. So,
Catherine,
anyway,
it sounds like you continue to be flabbergasted by that bill.
Yes, to say the least.
Oh my God! Well, I hope there's some relief in sight for you, and I'm going to talk right now to Eric about that bill and any thoughts he might have on that. Thank you, Catherine. So she's talking about the delivery fee being higher than the usage fee. So it's like, what do I do? And in Catherine's case, it sounds like she's doing right by the environment. She's got some solar panels on, but that bill ain't necessarily going down, I guess.
Yeah, Catherine, I think that you're expressing a pretty common sentiment amongst a lot of people in Connecticut who look at their electricity bill and really get shocked that they see it broken down into this sort of the supply or the usage part of the bill, and then often the distribution part, which is sometimes shockingly high, right? So in Connecticut, the supply of electricity is unbundled or separated from the distribution parts. So the big utility companies like Eversource are not doing electricity generation. They're purchasing the actual electricity supply from third-party producers on the open market, and they're passing that through one-to-one to consumers. So they're not marking up the electricity supply. But then the core business of the utilities, the core part where they are able to make money, is on the distribution segment. So that's maintaining and investing in the grid infrastructure, the poles, the hookups, and all of that last mile delivery part. And that's where you're seeing that large distribution charge. That charge is, as you're saying, you feel like that's really high. A lot of people share that sentiment, and that reflects on a big debate, a big policy, public policy debate right now about how the government through the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority should be, regulating the ability of utilities to set rates and increase rates, which is purely reflected in that distribution charge. So that's a current debate right now about, what those rates should be.
I'm simple-minded, but like Catherine, I'm thinking about my bill. I'm taking away from the conversation that you just had or the explanation there that it's going to be high as long as our infrastructure is as such, right? The big problem is we're not generating enough supply. We don't have the infrastructure. We're at the end of the pipeline for natural gas. We're relying on other states for wind energy and hydropower. So, it's going to be like this for a little while, I would imagine. Is that what you're telling us?
So to some extent, yes, there's limited options to really dramatically reduce prices, both on the supply side and on the distribution side. So from supply, it's, where can Connecticut find cheaper sources of electricity generation? And we can have a bigger discussion about what those might be. We've talked about nuclear. Currently, Connecticut is locked into a long-term, high-cost contract for nuclear power from the Millstone power plant. We can talk about solar. We can talk about offshore wind, natural gas. There's a whole variety of options for finding cheaper supply. And then there's this distribution segment. So Eversource and UI and utilities have to invest to maintain complicated grid infrastructures. This is increasingly complicated as people, plug in more electric cars, as we get more distributed solar and things like that. But there's also a question about regulating utilities so that they're, charging appropriate rates and making what society thinks is an appropriate profit margin. For the services that they're providing. So that's a public policy discussion that I think is fair to have.
Before we get into that public policy discussion, because I know it's a hot topic at the state legislature right now, just want to peel back and talk about the resources. You were talking about energy generation. Right now, we are relying heavily on natural gas. Could you tell us about how much, John, we rely on, at least how much of this supports our grid right now?
Yeah, so nuclear is about 1/3 of the electricity that is generated in Connecticut, and natural gas makes up the vast majority of the rest. If you go onto ISO New England's website, they actually have a real-time resource mix where you can see day-to-day where we are getting our electricity from. And it's important to remember that while the utilities are purchasing electricity on behalf of their customers in Connecticut, because we exist on a regional grid, really, an electron that goes into the grid in New Hampshire could be used to turn on a light bulb in Connecticut and vice versa. In the wintertime, as Eric mentioned, we have these things called peaker plants. And when the demand for natural gas increases so much because people are also using it to heat their homes, you'll see on certain really cold days, like we got a lot of snow last night, you might see petroleum jump up in the resource mix because these older plants that are off for the majority of the year get turned on and burn petroleum in order to meet the needs.
So it sounds like natural gas is not necessarily going to be an option that, I guess, cuts our bills down dramatically, at least. So why do we continue thinking about this as an option? Why is this something that we have to continue to use?
I think when you talk to lawmakers, a lot of them want to take an all of the above approach. So supply usage, as we were talking about before, that takes up about 20-25% of the bill, I think, when I looked at my most recent bill. So natural gas will affect that portion of the bill. It won't really affect your distribution rates going down, and you'll have to look at different public policies to address that.
Nuclear power. You talked about it being 1/3 of what we generate on a given day, or what we use on a given day. So what goes into using more nuclear power, and is that something that people think can help us over the long term?
So the only nuclear power plant in Connecticut is Millstone, which is located in Waterford. The plant is several decades old, and up until recently, there was actually a moratorium in Connecticut on building any new nuclear power. 2 or 3 years ago, lawmakers came in and they actually lifted that moratorium, but specifically for the Millstone site. So what you hear when talking about nuclear is actually mostly people talking about these things called smaller modular reactors, which isn't really the classic giant nuclear power plant that you think of. Historically, these are smaller reactors, maybe about 300 megawatts, that can be manufactured off-site and brought in. I don't know of any that are actually online in the United States, so this is more of a forward-thinking solution where lawmakers are talking about when the technology is there, it's something they'd like to invite into the state.
I'm sure that's something that's an exciting challenge for nuclear physicists and nuclear engineers. Does any utility company, Eric, have like a monopoly over the system here in Connecticut? Or at least are there maybe a couple of companies that are more prominent here? And how does that impact pricing?
Sure, that's an important part of the system, right? So Connecticut has several regulated monopolies. So these are companies that you see on your electricity bill, like Eversource or UI, and these are they're called regulated monopolies because the electricity grid, it doesn't really make sense to have a bunch of companies building separate grids and competing with each other and duplicating all of that infrastructure. It would be really inefficient. And so it's a natural monopoly because it makes sense to just have one or two companies doing this. But however, monopolies by their nature will typically overcharge and undersupply services unless you regulate them in the public interest. And so pretty much everywhere that has this type of system, pretty much in every state, there's a public utility commission whose job it is to regulate and oversee these monopolies so that they are, setting their prices and making their investments to provide, high quality electricity distribution for reasonable prices for the household and the business consumers.
I want to open this next question up to both of you. I'll start with John because I want to know how lawmakers are addressing this. Is this a simple supply and demand issue? Like the demand, I would imagine, has gone up in Connecticut. Is that true? And if so, why?
It has gone up, and experts predict that it's going to continue going up in the coming years. Part of it, as Eric mentioned, is more people plugging in their electric cars or various appliances at home that might be sapping up more energy, even though we have done a lot on energy efficiency that's helped lower some of that demand. But at the same time that's coming online, you have things like data centers, AI, all these new technologies that really suck a lot of electricity from the grid that are going to pose a challenge for us in the future.
What do you think, Eric?
Yeah, I totally agree. And another part to consider is not just changes in electricity demand, but also the challenges associated with creating sort of a smart grid, right? So more and more people want rooftop solar, and they want to feed it back into the system when they're producing more than they need in their household. And all of that sort of net metering and feeding back into the grid creates complexity. Smart metering and being able to do dynamic pricing so that the utility can set pricing sort of hour to hour to manage spikes in demand versus supply, and also distributed generation. So things like utility scale solar, which is when you see solar panels out in a field somewhere, that type of electricity generation is more distributed than our traditional system where we had a few giant power plants. So all of that makes constructing and managing this grid increasingly challenging.
Tremendous conversation thus far. Anybody tuning into the Wheelhouse, including the host of this program right now, feel smarter by talking to Eric Kotovich, who is the professor of environmental and resource economics at the University of Connecticut, and of course, good friend John Moritz, reporter covering energy and environmental policy for the Connecticut Mirror. They're going to stick around for a little bit. Coming up, a look at the tension between the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, aka PURA, and Connecticut utility companies like Eversource, United Illuminating, Avangrid. What do your electric bills look like these days? Tell us. 888-720-9677. 888-720-9677. More Wheelhouse in a moment. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. Why are Connecticut's energy bills so high? And what can people do about the soaring costs? Joining me to shed some light on this is Eric Kotovich, the assistant professor of environmental and resource economics at UConn, and John Moritz, reporter covering energy and environmental policy for the Connecticut Mirror. Let us know what questions you have about your electric bills, 888-720-9677. Shout out to Catherine in Norfolk, who told us about her energy bills earlier. We were able to kind of dissect this and at least help her try to understand what's happening. Not that anybody wants to understand, because I'm sure they just want to pay less for electricity. John, Connecticut's largest electric, gas, and water utilities companies, Eversource and Avangrid, or at least the largest companies that serve Connecticut, have filed a lawsuit against their state regulators, accusing the leader of the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority of wielding too much control over their business. Somebody's name we're hearing about a lot right now is Marissa Gillette. Or is it Melissa Gillette? I'm forgetting off the top.
Marissa Gillette.
Marissa, it is. Why are we hearing Marissa's name so much?
So Marissa Gillette is Governor Ned Lamont's appointee to chair PURA. She came on board in 2019, and a lot of the frustrations and back and forth between her and the utilities kind of date back to then. She's taken an approach, what she calls performance-based regulation, which is really trying to look at, as Eric mentioned before, the utilities in the regulated market that we have are allowed to make a profit off the investments that they make in Connecticut. She argues that, for too long, the state regulators didn't really look at whether those investments were in the best interest of ratepayers, and is trying to take a more serious look at whether those are, always the right and necessary investments to make, and then also, how much profit they're allowed to make off of that. The utilities are basically arguing that the approach that she's taken over the past couple of years has cut into their profits, particularly when compared to some of the neighboring states that they also operate in, and that it's making it a more difficult regulatory environment for them to do their business and invest here in Connecticut. So there's kind of been this long simmering tension between the two sides there, and it really fizzled over the surface last week with this lawsuit that they filed.
There's that effort. I also understand there's an effort to go public with concerns that they have about pricing here in Connecticut, and at least try to address some of the concerns that ratepayers have. Susan Raff told me that she recently went to Berlin and went to the facility, I think, that Eversource has down there, and it was part of an effort to maybe, I don't know, try to maybe get people to be empathetic to what's happening there. So is this a situation where we should be feeling bad for the companies here, or just help us understand what they're going through versus the job that PURA has to do here ahead?
Well, I think their argument, as you mentioned, the facility they have in Berlin, their argument is that a lot of the technology that goes into building and maintaining the distribution network nowadays, because as we talked about before, they're not actually generating electricity. They're just buying it and sending it to people's homes. That technology is really expensive. They just announced in Cambridge last week, the opening of this big new state-of-the-art facility that they invested in there, and the story that you hear from them is that, if we want to make these types of investments here in Connecticut, that costs money. And, our business model is investor-owned, for-profit business model, so they need to be able to make some money off it. So that's, I think, the story they're telling, whether that's, the story that people in Connecticut want to be empathetic to is up to them.
Eric, walk me through some of the interests at play here. So we talked about a couple of the stakeholders here. We have the state regulatory authority, we have the people, and we have a company. So help us understand why you might see an Eversource having trouble with some of the dynamics at play here with profits being cut into, and then a regulatory authority being concerned about how Eversource is charging folks.
Yeah, so I think that, it's not bad thing that there's a sort of a naturally oppositional relationship between a public, utility regulator and the regulated utilities. That's sort of a situation that's set up to have different sides competing and trying to voice their interests. And it's important that the regulatory authority representing the people of the state of Connecticut has the ability to also make its voice heard. For a long time, that authority just passed through, approving all of the rate increases that were requested, resulting in high electricity bills for consumers. So the fact that they're standing up now a little bit and pushing back on the utilities is doing their job as a regulator, right? So at the same time, we can't just blindly, think that it's always a good idea to shoot down every rate increase because, like John pointed out, large investments are needed to maintain, a high-quality grid infrastructure, to maintain reliability and integrate renewables into our grid. So that's sort of some of these competing interests. If you look at Eversource is considered one of the more profitable electricity utility companies in the U.S. They've returned, profit rates over the last 10 years between 10 and 14% annually. So, you could think as a society, what is an appropriate profit level for a regulated utility? That's a discussion that we could have. They took a large loss this past year because an unregulated segment of the company, so a part that's outside of their distribution business, made large investments in offshore wind, and they ran into some problems with that and eventually backed out, taking a pretty large loss. So that they, could be pointed to as something that's created some challenges in this past year with profitability for Eversource. But that's, again, in a separate segment of their business that doesn't, necessarily directly affect the rates they should be charging to consumers.
And it's not just a question about supply and demand here and power generation. There's also other reasons why Pura might be interested in what businesses are doing. We know that they've amped up regulation efforts since there was that whole debacle with Norwich Utilities a few years ago, with the retreats at, I think, that resort in West Virginia, and then the Kentucky Derby. So this is not just a situation where we're talking about what is happening with supply and demand. It's also trying to make sure that these companies are doing right by their customers.
Exactly. So I think there has been effort by legislators to make sure that Eversource and UI are not able to count things like lobbying expenditures, payments to the Board of Governors, and sort of executive bonuses and things like that, not able to count those in the costs when they're trying to figure out what is their legitimate costs of maintaining the grid versus their profit margin. So I think that's progress in the right direction, thinking about having access to data and transparency for the regulator to understand what are the investments being made by these utilities, and are they really in the public interest.
Wind power, one possible alternative to natural gas. Does the state have any wind power projects that in the works currently? And I think it would be understandable if anybody was confused about what's happening with wind power in Connecticut, because there seems to be a back and forth on whether or not we're even involved in negotiations. So help us understand this.
So there is one project that is going to be coming online. I think it's estimated right now for late 2026. That's Revolution Wind, which is about a dozen miles off, if I recall, off the coast of Block Island. Last year, Sunrise Wind, which is a wind farm that was deployed from the state pier in New London, which some of your listeners may recall, the state invested a lot of money in redeveloping as a launching point for offshore wind. That came online last year, but the power from that is actually being sent to Long Island, so it's not coming into Connecticut. Revolution Wind, the power will be split between Connecticut and Rhode Island. But beyond that, there are no wind facilities that currently have power purchase agreements with Connecticut and that are coming online. And last year, the state announced that they were declining to participate in this kind of consortium with Massachusetts and Rhode Island to procure new offshore wind energy. And with the Trump administration coming on earlier this month, I think that's called into question whether we're going to see any new offshore wind projects in the next couple of years.
Yeah, so it sounds like wind is not something we can necessarily rely on this part to be a part of that situation where we have natural gas, some nuclear power, petroleum in the winter. So
at least for the next few years.
At least for the next few years, yes. there's also the specter of a trade war with between the United States and Canada. Major supplier of hydropower to Connecticut. This was highlighted in a recent story by your colleague, Jan Ellen Spiegel. She reported on a potential 10% tariff, I want to get this right, imposed on Canadian energy and electricity. Is that a real thing, John? Could that impact bills here, or does that just get to the situation where lawmakers and local officials are just worried about what might happen at the federal government level, and it's not really a real thing yet?
I think it is a very real concern. I would have to ask Jan. I don't know. I believe those tariffs were temporarily put on pause as they negotiate further. But in addition to that potentially affecting hydropower that comes down from Quebec, Canada is obviously also a huge source of natural gas that flows into the United States, and that, as we know, provides most of our electricity here. So there's also a big potential should those tariffs go into place to impact that.
They are on pause, but that's the point I think we wanted to make here, that if there is an issue between Canada and the United States, if it does get all the way to a trade war, we'd be pretty impacted here because we rely so much on their energy. Any tips to help consumers understand the pricing aspect of it? Thankfully, you were here when Catherine from Norfolk had a call earlier. Do you have any advice for our listeners on what portions of their electric bills they should be paying close attention to, if at all?
So the part of the electric bill that you can potentially affect is the usage or the supply part of the charge. So that, again, is unbundled from distribution, and you're able to go and shop around. There's online platforms where you can shop around and switch your electricity usage or your supplier to another company. So there's a variety of companies. It's not going to give you a huge amount of savings, but you might save a few dollars a month. So it's worth taking a look and thinking whether you want to switch to a different supplier. Again, you're kind of stuck with the distributor that you have in your area. So that part of the charge is unfortunately much harder to change at the household level. There's a variety of other things that we can do as households to try to reduce electricity bills. So you can look into like a home energy efficiency audit where they'll come over, and do some tests and analyses, give you some tips about what you could change about your house to be more efficient. And households can also consider things like heat pumps and rooftop solar. It might not make sense for every household, and unfortunately, it's often quite complicated for households to figure out a whole variety of contractual arrangements and financing plans and options for rebates and subsidies that are often really confusing to access. I think there's scope for public policy to make it easier for households to understand those options and actually access the types of potential incentives they have for thinking about things like heat pumps and rooftop solar.
Is that consistent with what the Lamont administration is telling people to do, or is there anything else in there that people should be trying to do?
Yeah, I think one of the energy efficiency has been one of their big pushes in recent years, and DEEP has a lot of programs, as Eric mentioned, and you can even go through. I believe the utilities offer services that you can access, and he also mentioned, looking at potential different suppliers of electricity. One of the reforms that lawmakers passed several years ago, because there was some concern that people were being taken advantage of, is while these are fixed term contracts that he's talking about, you can actually, the consumer can leave at any time. So for example, if you sign a 6-month contract to purchase electricity on the Connecticut marketplace at a specific price, and then 3 months down the line, you see, prices have gone down, you can switch at no cost to yourself.
Very important conversation that we just had with John Moritz, the energy and environmental reporter, policy reporter for the Connecticut Mirror. John, thank you so much for coming on the show this morning.
Thank you for having me.
And of course, Eric Kotovich, the assistant professor of environmental and resource economics at UConn. Eric, thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys for making us smarter and helping us understand our energy bills a bit. Coming up, we're going to hear about proposed changes to school funding for students with disabilities in Connecticut. Love for you to join that conversation as well. 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Stay tuned for one more segment of the Wheelhouse. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. Governor Ned Lamont is prioritizing funding for students with disabilities during this year's legislative session, or at least he says he is, but that doesn't mean everyone is happy with his proposed budget. Of course, you got to go through the legislature. To help us understand that, I'm joined by Jessica Harkey, education reporter for the Connecticut Mirror. Jessica, so glad to have you on today.
Thanks for having me, Frankie.
Thanks for coming back to the studio. Also with us, Ebong Udama, senior political reporter for WSHU. Ebong, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Great to see you this morning. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Hey, Jessica, during a news briefing at the state capitol in Hartford, Governor Ned Lamont announced that his budget includes these proposals to change funding for students with disabilities. What are some of those changes?
Yeah, so the two biggest changes is in total, he wants to give $54 million into special education. And that's not funding that we're going to see until fiscal year 27. So just for context, we're in fiscal year 25 right now. That's all the way till July, and every fiscal year resets in July. So that's something we're not going to see until 2026. And so that $54 million is divided into $40 million that would go into excess cost. What that basically means is special education with some students with severe disabilities, they're sent out of district. And when those costs for tuition or whatever transportation add up to more than 4.5 times what the actual cost of educating a pupil is, then districts can see some reimbursement. So he wants to invest $40 million into that grant that already is underfunded. And the second thing is investing $14 million into trying to develop programs to keep those students in district, because one of the biggest costs is when you send a student out of district, you're paying tuition rates. There isn't a cap on those tuition rates. So you could be paying upwards of $100,000 for a child to be outsourced in a district and receive education. So those were the two biggest proposals that he recommended in his budget.
Educators and advocates, Ebong, have long been asking for increased funding for students with disabilities. Why the bump this year?
Well, because, it costs a lot of money. The special education budgets in Connecticut amount to about $2.8 billion a year. And most of that is the local districts, and they're only reimbursed what Jessica was saying about the excess cost grants, which, they're reimbursed part of the money. So this will boost it a little bit, but it's not that much. And special education is extremely expensive, especially if you are taking the children out of district. So that's why there's also the emphasis to have more programs within the district to try and reduce the cost.
The prospect of diminishing federal funds is the elephant in the room. Do we know who'd be impacted most if that money goes away, or even how they might be impacted?
Yes, the cities, the largest cities are the ones that shoulder the burden for special education. About 20% of special education children are in the largest cities of Bridgeport, New Haven, and Hartford. And it eats up about 20 to 30% of their education budget. So that's a huge chunk. And if the federal money goes, the state will have to fill that gap, because the cities certainly would not be able to.
How are legislators, Jessica, responding to Governor Lamont's suggestion that maybe the state dips into surplus funds? And is this something that seems like it's kind of, I don't know, a maiden voyage or a first time for Connecticut, that we're actually considering, at least under the Lamont administration, to use some of these surplus funds for something like this?
I think the response is kind of what you would expect it to be. A lot of Republicans are critical of going into this surplus funding, while some Democrats are saying, you know what, we need to invest in these services. I think one of the things that is most interesting about this debate is there was a task force that was convened by statute back in 2021, if I'm not mistaken, and they came out with their final recommendations for special education earlier this year, and they were calling for a lot more funding. They say, well, we need to fully fund excess cost. And those costs right now in this fiscal year are over $300 million. Connecticut's funding that to about $181 million. So that's still a big chunk of money that's missing. There were other proposals out there that were calling for tuition like grants, that if you go and you study to be a teacher and teach certifications or have a certification in special education, maybe we give some money into this tuition so you can go and not have that financial burden of getting an education and going into the classroom. So what I'm hearing a lot of is just there's a lot of criticisms, I think, on both sides. There's some saying it's not enough. There's other people saying we can't be going into our surpluses funds, especially as you guys mentioned, of this looming threat of if federal funding is cut.
$54 million. You're talking about a $2.8 billion budget for special education at Bong. That's not a lot of money. Because I thought about, I'm trying to do the calculator math here real quick, but I'm also hosting a show. But Jessica says that some people would like $300 million. 54 into $300 million, that's about a sixth of what people are looking for. So help us out here.
Well, they'll take it and ask for more. That's what's going on. But it is an issue, and the problem that we have is that the state has to come up with a budget before the federal budget, before they know what's coming down from the federal government. Although we might have a sense because of they're preparing a budget right now on the federal level, but it's not. We're not too sure what's going to happen, especially if they abolish the Department of Education and send the money to the states. How would that be determined?
Jessica, the excess cost grant that you mentioned earlier in the show. What have educators told you about why it's important that we find ways to educate more of these students requiring these additional resources within their districts rather than having their parents pull students out of district to get the education services they need?
I think there's two aspects to that. The first, on more of just like a human level, is it's good to be educated in your own district, right? It's good to know that your friends live in your neighborhood. It's easier to see them after school. It's easier to participate in sports. So I think that's one of the aspects of when you keep a kid in district, they're in their own community rather than having to be bused maybe upwards of an hour away. How do you hang out with those kids after school kind of thing? So I think that's one aspect of it. But the second thing, kind of what we've been talking about, is just the cost. When you are sending kids out of district and you're spending $100,000 on one student, so basically what those costs also come from is in these private programs, the way they are able to hire teachers, they can have more competitive salaries. And then that just kind of is a burden back on the district. So I think there's this push and pull of we need to invest and keep these kids in district because in the long term, it's going to be cost savings. If we can find a way to have competitive salaries for these special education teachers, maybe they can take more students in those classrooms instead of only sending one student for that same cost.
And there's an added issue here because there's not a set amount of money for each child. Each child, depending on their needs, the funding will increase depending on the needs. So a school district that has not had to deal with a special ed student, all of a sudden they get 3 the next year and the budget is totally blown. So it's the uncertainty about how much you're going to be, especially for the small districts that don't have that many students. Just having 1 or 2 special ed students can play havoc on their budgets.
It can, but being in the community of families with special needs or with students with developmental disabilities and intellectual disabilities as well, you understand that, first of all, folks are entitled by federal law to an education. And then, of course, there's also a consideration that it just makes people's lives easier when they're able to go in district. So I understand why there's that back and forth, as you see that some school districts obviously feel like they can't pay, but also are entitled to provide this education. So you had a chance to talk, Jessica, to Connecticut Education Associate President Kate Diaz. What did she have to say about this proposal?
I think it kind of goes back to what Ebong said of any money is good money. When you're having these conversations and you're seeing at least a little investment, that's a step in the right direction. I think one of Kate's biggest criticisms is, again, who's educating these kids? Even if we're putting money into the excess cost grant and we're trying to develop programs, there still is this elephant of the room of a teacher shortage. We don't have teachers in the classrooms. It's really hard to recruit teachers into the classrooms right now. I mean, a big conversation is pay. Para-educators. A lot of people always use the analogy you can make more at McDonald's than being a para-educator. And so I think that's the big criticism there is, yes, these investments into programs and keeping students in district is obviously useful and welcomed, but at the same time, there needs to be an investment in the actual personnel and recruiting people into this, making an enticing profession, because those are the people actually working with these kids. You can invest money all you want into programs, but if you have no one to staff them, what good are the programs?
Shout out to the paras out there, because when you're talking about this education and talking to these families as I have and being in this community, it is so important to have one-to-one support. That's really what can make a difference in a child's life. And those para-educators are carrying out that job. Ebong, this isn't the end of the story, right? The proposed increase obviously needs to go through the state legislature. So help us understand what we could look for next. Is this something that'll go through a committee anytime soon? I know that at the end of the month, we'll start having some public meetings.
Well, basically what happens is the governor makes his proposal, and that starts the conversation. And then the appropriations and the finance committees meet, and they try and hammer out some type of committee proposal. And what normally happens is that we end up with the Democrats have that, not because they have the majority. Generally, it's whatever the Democrats want that gets passed, and then they have to reach some type of compromise with the governor before a bill comes back and is passed. So we've got a ways to go, but that's pretty much the conversation right now is on whether or not how much. The governor has decided that he's prepared to adjust the guardrails. So how much of an adjustment we get will be the issue in the conversation going forward.
I'll give you the last minute here, Jessica. Help me understand what to look forward to next, or at least stakeholders we should be watching throughout this process. Is there a particular committee meeting that you're looking at? Or is there also the federal funding issue, which I know could come afterwards, but what should we be watching here in the next month or so?
I think what I'm watching right now is there's a select committee on special education this session, and they're doing listening tours across the state. I think they had their first one last week. They have two this week. I think their upcoming ones are in Bridgeport and Hartford, which, back to what Ebong said, are some of the biggest districts that are educating students with disabilities. And so these are opportunities for people to come out and talk to lawmakers to their face and say, this is an issue, this is a problem, this is what we want to see. And this select committee is supposed to give recommendations and propose bills that will then go to the education committee. So that's something I think I'm watching, is that you have lawmakers who are going out into communities. This is an opportunity for families who have students with disabilities and children with disabilities to actually make their voices heard and say, what is an issue? Is your child receiving the services they need?
Jessica Harke working very hard to get this information out to the people of Connecticut and covering students with disabilities and education as a whole for the Connecticut Mirror. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks, Frankie.
Look at her work at ctmirror.org. Hey, Ebong Udama also on the show today, senior political reporter for WSHU. You can find his work at wshu.org. Ebong, thank you so much.
Thank you, Frank.
Today's show produced by Chloe Wynn, edited by Robin Doyen-Aiken and Meg Dalton. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download the Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. I'm Frankie Graziano. Happy Valentine's Day. We love you all. This is the Wheelhouse. A big radio hug to all of you. Thank you for listening.